Hey guys, it's me. Before I get to the review, I just wanted to let you guys know what was going on. No, I'm not sick. I don't have the virus, as far as I know. I'm okay. I'm still working. I have a job that's considered essential, so to speak. So I am still able to go to work and get paid and do all the things that I need to do. But I'm also trying to be as smart as I can and be careful with how I communicate with people and so on and so forth. This past week has been a roller coaster of emotions for me, and I'm sure it's been that way for a lot of people out there right now. I don't want to preach or anything, but you guys know what to do. Take all the precautions necessary, wash your hands, all that stuff you hear a million times. Be safe, be smart, and use your best judgment possible if you have to go out and buy food and get gas for your car or whatever you need to do. Just be smart. And please, for God's sake, don't hoard toilet paper, don't hoard paper towels, and don't share things that are meant to incite hysteria and fear and panic. That doesn't do anybody any good. And we will get through this. We will get through this. As hard as that may be to believe right now, I know that we're going to get through it. The road to getting there, well, that's the ultimate deciding factor. Anyway, just wanted you to know I'm okay, I'm hanging in there, and since everybody's acting like the apocalypse is happening, what better way to talk about it than a movie that's set during the apocalypse? So if you guys didn't see my last video, I talked about Rise of the Machines, Terminator 3. So I'm here today to talk about the 4th edition in the franchise, Terminator Salvation, directed by McG, starring Christian Bale, Sam Worthington, the late Anton Yelchin, Bryce Dallas Howard, amongst other people. The movie takes place in the year 2018, during the war against Skynet and its Terminators. John Connor's not yet the leader of the Resistance, but he's considered an important figure amongst the human survivors. And along the way, he runs into a man named Marcus Wright, played by Sam Worthington, who has mysteriously woken up with really no explanation. And he is a very special kind of person and proves to be a vital part in helping preserve the future for John Connor. And just in case you haven't seen the movie, there will be spoilers in this video. Like all the sequels that came out after Terminator 2, Salvation has been a very divisive entry in the franchise, and for various reasons that I've heard people talk about. This movie came out in 2009, 6 years after the third Terminator, but for some reason I wasn't as excited to see it because the trailers made it look very bland and just very dour and just kind of generic, and it gave off a very Transformers vibe, given that the first Transformers came out 2 years prior to this, and Revenge of the Fallen came out in the same year as this one. And we'll talk about it later, but Arnold's technically not in this movie, given that he was still governor of California at the time. Christian Bale was playing John Connor as opposed to Nick Stahl. Something about it from the trailers didn't feel quite right. But as a Terminator fan, I was still willing to give it the benefit of the doubt. Plus, since Christian Bale had received a huge amount of stardom from playing Batman at the time, obviously a lot of people were interested in seeing what he was going to do, myself included. And at the time, I really enjoyed it, but I didn't think it was quite as good as the previous ones. Having watched it now over 10 years later, I would say it's not too bad. I like it personally. Now, when I say that I like it, obviously I'm not saying that it's a perfect movie. And trust me, there's a lot of stuff in here that weighs the movie down. But I don't think it's as bad as some have claimed. But like with the previous film, it's definitely got its issues. So where to begin with Terminator Salvation? Well, on the one hand, as opposed to the previous 3 films, there's no time travel element that's thrown into the mix. We actually get to see the future war happening, and that we saw glimpses of in the previous films, but this is about a decade or so before Kyle goes back to 1984. And it's not the same war that was talked about in the first 2 films. It's a very different type of war, and it's a very different type of Skynet that the humans are fighting. It's more or less the same, but considering the events of Terminator 2, the timeline was altered, and a different version of Skynet has risen up. And based on the things that I've heard from detractors over the years, that people assume that this is a prequel. I thought that for a while too, but when you think about it in terms of the 4 films, it's not really a prequel. It's clearly a sequel to Terminator 3, because the opening scene where we see Marcus sitting in the prison cell on death row, it's set in the year 2003, which is the same year that Terminator 3 takes place in. And it also feeds into another critique that I've heard. Why does the action take place during the day? Kyle says in the first film that they only fight at night. Okay, that's a good point, but you gotta remember that this is a completely different timeline. But then there's the notion of this taking place in 2018 and not 2027 or 2029. You could say that the tactics of warfare change between 2018 and 2029. And plus, I also think it's a smarter idea to fight during the daytime. Kyle says that HKs use infrared to hunt their enemies. Even in the first film, when he says that, I always had the question of, wouldn't it be a smarter move to stay down by night and move around during the daytime when they're not really good at using their infrared? It's just something from the first film that I went, hold on a minute, that doesn't sound right. I'll try not to respond too much to the criticisms because I have some of my own, obviously. Then there's also the notion of, how did Skynet know that Kyle Reese is John Connor's dad? Well, That is a really good question, because as Kyle says in the first film, most of the records were lost during the war, that it didn't really know much about Connor's mother except the city that she lived in. You could probably assume that it did some research on John Connor, hearing stories from infiltration units that he used to spy on Connor and his allies. And then also the TX in Terminator 3 coincidentally knew about John Connor and the previous attempts to kill him. More than likely she uploaded all that information to the machines when she activated them. Yeah, a bit of clarity would suffice, but that's the way I see it anyway. But as I said, John Connor is not yet the leader of the Resistance, but he is considered a prophet by the human survivors across the planet, and by others as a false prophet, particularly the one leader of the human resistance, General Ashdown, played by Michael Ironside. John's also the member of the TechCom unit that was mentioned by Kyle in the first film. Given that the previous experiences that he's had in encountering Terminators, and how all the information that he's giving to people all over the world are turning out to be true, just about every resistance fighter looks up to him and respects him. He also frequently gives out radio messages to people across the planet, teaching them how to fight Terminators, and we also see a couple of scenes of him listening to audio tapes from his mother, which actually Linda Hamilton returned to do the voice recording for those tapes so he can try to figure out, okay, how do I fight against Skynet? What am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to find Kyle Reese? Then we have Marcus Wright, played by Sam Worthington, who mysteriously wakes up in the future with practically no explanation. He's someone who was put on death row in 2003, right before Judgment Day happened, and now he's woken up about 15 years later, trying to figure out exactly what's going on. Then he heads to the ruins of downtown LA, where he runs into a young Kyle Reese, played by Anton Yelchin, and after listening to a certain radio message from John Connor, they embark on a quest to find John Connor and the Resistance, so Marcus can figure out what's going on. I'm finding it a little difficult to try to articulate my thoughts without sounding like I'm repeating what's been said before, but I really mean this, that I don't think the movie's as bad as people have said it is. I actually do respect this movie for trying something different in a way that progresses the story forward of the Terminator franchise, even though I have to say the execution could have been a bit better. Much, much better, actually. That being said, though, it's not a horrible movie. It's not disrespecting the franchise. It's not doing a Terminator Genesis where it completely erases everything from the first two films. And this movie, by no stretch of the imagination, lives up to the legacy of the first two films. But in a way, it does progress the story forward, and it gives us some little bits of connective tissue that were touched upon in the first film, such as Marcus trying to teach Kyle how to tie the shotgun to his arm, or Kyle being locked up in a prison camp by Skynet. In fact, the late Anton Yelchin, who plays Kyle Reese, I'm just gonna say it, he is by far the best part of this movie, and God rest his soul, gone way too soon. I've always thought that he was the perfect fit to play Kyle Reese. He looks and sounds a lot like Michael Biehn from the first film. Even though there's not a whole lot of character depth to him, and the same thing for the other characters as we'll talk about, this feels like a young Michael Biehn from the year 2018. And when I first saw this, the moment that he said,
"Come with me if you want to live,"
I knew right away that was Kyle Reese. Even if you don't like this movie, you can't deny that Anton Yelchin was a perfect fit for the character. And I love the moment when he and John meet for the first time in the prison camp, and they don't have a whole ton of screen time together, but this moment...
What's your name? Kyle Reese.
I gotta admit, it's a small moment, but it gives me shivers every time. Father and son meeting for the first time. Speaking of that, John Connor is played by Christian Bale. I've heard some pretty divisive things about the casting of the character. I actually like Christian Bale as John Connor. Some people have criticized his acting in this film, that he was just bland or really bad. I don't really think so. I think he actually does a fine job as the character, although there's a couple of moments where his Batman voice comes out.
What did we find down there?
You'll be briefed on a need-to-know basis.
Well, I need to know. Because my men died down in that hole.
But some of my favorite moments of Christian Bale in this film is when he's talking to his wife, saying that, I looked in that guy's eyes, and it absolutely believes that it is human. That thing in there makes me feel like I know nothing. And then when he pleads to the Resistance on the radio to not attack Skynet across the world, you can feel the emotion in his voice because he's so desperate to preserve his future and the future of the human race by saving Kyle Reese. And in terms of the 4 films that we've seen, this I would say feels like a natural progression of the character, from a scared kid to apprehensive hero to a hardened soldier, and one step closer to being considered the savior of the Resistance. Then we got Sam Worthington, and I'll be honest, for the longest time, I was not a fan of Sam Worthington. I thought he was a really, really bad actor, personally. That being said, though, I think he's actually gotten considerably better as an actor in recent years, particularly in The Shack and Hacksaw Ridge. And looking back on this movie, I would say that he's fine. It's just really the character that I think needed some fine-tuning, more or less. Now, he was a death row cellmate. From what we know, because of something that he did, his brother and 2 cops were killed, which ultimately resulted in his death sentence. And he's very harsh on himself, saying that I've been dead a while and I'm getting used to it, or asking the pilot Blair that he befriends that do you think people deserve a second chance? I think it's a good arc that he's someone who's messed up severely and accepts the best part of himself as a human being. The problem I have with it though, and I'm sure other people have pointed this out, is that we don't really know exactly what happened that led to him being on death row. When he says, my brother and 2 cops are dead because of me, well, what exactly happened? Did you get him killed? Was there a gunfight? What happened exactly? And I would say that's the biggest issue with the movie. The characters are not as well fleshed out as they could be. John Connor, being where he is now in this timeline, I would have liked a lot more time where he's actually talking to Kate, figuring out, is he ready to face the reality that he's been waiting for this whole life, being the leader and finding his father? Anton Yelchin does his best with what he's given, but Kyle Reese doesn't really have a whole lot to him as a character. Same with the character of Kate Brewster, this time played by Bryce Dallas Howard. She was just kind of there. She didn't really have a whole lot to do. Again, the character completely wasted. And then there's also Barnes, played by the rap star Common, who I don't think is a bad addition. He is kind of a cool character, but again, just like the other characters, he needed more development. And again, I'm sure other people have pointed this out, but also another big problem with this movie is that when Marcus meets Kyle for the first time, and he asks him what day is it, what year, and Kyle just says, 2018, Judgment Day happened. Not just him, but nobody really asks him, well, wait a second, how do you not know about Judgment Day? You're a grown adult. How could you not know that there's machines walking around killing everybody? The closest that we really get to that is when they're hiding out in that 7-Eleven getting food and Marcus is not eating any of it, and the old woman asks him, son, are you okay? Obviously, if you haven't eaten in days and you see some food in front of you, I know for myself, I'm going to be diving into that, trying to chow down as much as I can, but Marcus is just standing there, and except for the old lady, nobody's going like, dude, why aren't you eating? What's going on? I know it's a nitpick, but something about that always bothered me. Now, as far as the director, McG, he also made movies like This Means War with Tom Hardy and Chris Pine, and he also did the Charlie's Angels films from the early 2000s, which I'm going to admit it, they're somewhat of a guilty pleasure of mine personally. I think they're a lot of fun, albeit being very stupid and very over the top. Do I think he's a bad filmmaker? Not necessarily. He got his first experience making music videos, and I think it kind of shows. It feels very just kind of generic and standard. Although, there are some action scenes that are kind of fun. Probably the best one that this film has to offer is when Kyle, Marcus, and the young girl Star are being chased in the tow truck by the 2 motorcycle Terminators, or Moto Terminators as they're called. Then there's the fight scene between Marcus and the T-800 prototype. I also like some of the Terminator designs too. The Harvester, seeing how it picks up human survivors and puts them into that carrier, and the motorcycle Terminators, Moto Terminators, those I thought were really cool and expands on Skynet's arsenal. It doesn't just have endoskeleton Terminators walking around killing everybody, or those big tanks, or the big HKs. It's got a lot more capabilities than what we've seen. And then there's also the Hydra bots that go around grabbing people, and since I mentioned those things and the Moto Terminators, there are a couple times where this movie does come off a bit like Transformers. Particularly this moment. To me, it's an obvious flare of the Decepticons from Transformers. I wouldn't say it's necessarily a bad thing, but it does come off very similar some of the time. And we also get to see the T-600s that were mentioned by Kyle in the first film. And if you look really carefully on some of the models, they actually have the rubber skin that Kyle mentioned to Sarah, which in a lot of ways lines up with the first film and how they had rubber skin and they were easy to spot, but yet the T-800 comes along with real human skin. And we see the T-800 in this film go up against John Connor, but with a CGI recreation of Arnold's face. Thankfully, it's not on screen for very long, but it's pretty obvious that it's a CGI recreation on a body double. Back to Marcus Wright. The biggest spoiler in this movie is that he's actually a human hybrid Terminator. A human heart, a chip interface with his cerebral cortex, and Skynet has been secretly using him to lure John Connor into a trap in order to get him killed at Skynet headquarters. Based on the previous mistakes of the past, they decided to use a hybrid Terminator, which he's the only one of his kind, and Marcus is doing it on a subconscious level, but he's not really realizing what he's doing. And when Marcus finally accepts who he is inside, not a machine, but a man. Even though I think that there could have been more development with that, I still think it's a really nice arc. Oh, and another thing about Marcus, there's quite a few obvious hints that he's not exactly human, particularly this moment. Come on, skipping across the water like that, no human being in the world can do that. And also the fact that he barely bleeds up until the moment it's revealed that he's a hybrid. It's too obvious. He's a machine of some kind. If you really wanted to make it that surprising, when he falls off the prison ship like that, you don't show him skipping around the water like that. Just have his body go off screen. And then you show him later washed up ashore. Or at the very least, just show him falling into the water and nothing else. So they manage to beat the T-800, they blow up Skynet headquarters, but in the ensuing confrontation against the T-800, John's mortally wounded, and Marcus decides to donate his heart to John in order for him to survive, at the cost of his own life. John Connor becomes the new leader, and Kyle is placed under his command. And the movie ends. Despite all the issues I have with the movie, and a lot of other people do too, I think Terminator Salvation is harmless, entertaining, and fine popcorn entertainment at best. And the themes that it brings up, such as deserving a second chance, making cold calculated decisions instead of listening to what's on your heart and what's on your mind, or even the small moment where Kyle says, stay alive in here and in here. All those things I think are very relevant to the franchise, even though, like I said, the execution could have been better. But overall, I'd say Terminator Salvation is a harmless movie. Not great, necessarily, but not terrible either. And just like with Terminator 3, I'd rather watch this over the last two Terminator films that were made, which we will talk about later. Trust me, I've got some things to say about them. So those are my thoughts on Terminator Salvation. What are your thoughts on Terminator Salvation? Do you love it, like it, think it's alright, or do you hate it? Whatever the case is, comment below and tell me your thoughts, and I'll see you all very soon.